Our next presentation is ArchivesSpace in Cambridge, the story so far, presented by Natalie Adams and Tuan Pham of Cambridge University Library. In this session, Natalie and Tuan will discuss Cambridge University Library's implementation of ArchivesSpace. Topics covered will include the changes they have made to ArchivesSpace to work with the structure of resources and archival objects in ArchivesSpace and to adapt ArchivesSpace to fit local and UK archival practice. The process of developing local plugins and contributing these plugins back to ArchivesSpace core code. Natalie Adams is an archivist working as metadata specialist on Cambridge University Library's digital preservation program. She's worked as an archivist since 1996 and has been a tutor on the University of Dundee's postgraduate course in archives and records management. From 2019 to June of 2021, Natalie was systems archivist on the library's archive management system project to implement ArchivesSpace for the library and 30 other archive repositories based in Cambridge. She is a fellow of the UK Archives and Records Association and has just joined the ArchivesSpace Governance Board, representing very large member organizations. Tuan Pham joined Cambridge University Library in 2016 as head of software development. Since then, he has expanded the role as Digital Transformation Program Director, implementing strategic changes to collection management and services, including cloud migration and digital preservation. He's also involved in the Digital Preservation Coalition and is serving as director on the executive board. So Natalie and Tuan, I'll turn it over to you.
Right, thanks very much, Jessica. Can I just check that you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect, thank you very much. So I'm going to start our presentation this afternoon by giving you a little bit of background to our ArchivesSpace instance and give you the archivist perspective on the plugins we've developed. And then I'll hand over to Tuan and he'll present on behalf of Nick Butler, who is one of our software developers who's currently cycling from the bottom of the country to the top and can't be with us today. And Tuan's going to talk about the process of development and contributing to ArchivesSpace core code. So the background to our project, sorry, I'm just trying to move on to the next slide and it's not going. Give me a second. There we go. So the background to our ArchivesSpace is on this slide. Basically, our installation is used by staff working with archives at the University Library, but we've had this good response from other local repositories and got a lot of other repositories on our system as well. They range widely in size, and in total, we've got over 80 registered users. There are massive benefits to researchers of us having all our data in one place when it comes to the discovery side, because they can plan a visit to the city of Cambridge and find out what they can see in all these different places. So preparing for this presentation has been a really good opportunity for me to step back and think about the broader themes that underline the changes we've made to ArchivesSpace. We haven't got long to talk to you, so I'm only going to pick out two main themes. And the first one here is working with the structure of resources and archival objects in ArchivesSpace. So as it was for many of you, I'm sure, it was a steep learning curve for us to get to grips with ArchivesSpace, plus all the sources of information that were available to us as members. And the structure of resources and archival objects was probably the hardest issue for us. The systems that we'd used before ArchivesSpace allowed us to create hierarchical archival descriptions, and the system functionality was available at all levels of a catalogue. So we just came to ArchivesSpace expecting the same, and it took us quite a long time to be sure that we'd understood that there were significant limits on functionality at archival object level. So a couple of examples: you can't export PDFs or EADs from archival objects, and you can't publish all at archival object level. Prior to ArchivesSpace being implemented, the library had used several separate systems for archival catalogues, and collections were mostly managed quite separately from one another. So you can imagine that bringing the library's catalogues together into one repository has given us some massive benefits. We've reduced silo working considerably, and for the first time, we can evaluate priorities right across our holdings. But it's also meant that we ended up with some massive resources. So, for example, the University Archives catalogue has over 90,000 records in it. And that means much less functionality for the archivist, especially relating to publishing sections of catalogues. We also found that our system wasn't able to cope with exporting our largest collections as EAD or PDFs just because of their size. So we made several changes to increase functionality at archival object level and to make these very large resources much easier to work with. So we adapted the OAI feed to generate top-level only EAD records, and we added the ability to create EAD files from archival objects. This was so that we could support our digitization workflow. We added the ability to generate PDFs at archival object level, making the catalogues much easier to work with for researchers. And we added the ability to publish all at archival object level. That was a massive time saver for archivists working with big collections, because we migrated quite a lot of catalogues as unpublished, and we wanted to kind of review them in sections and then publish them in sections too. And finally, we updated find and replace so that it could be used for archival object records too. The second category of changes were to adapt ArchivesSpace so that it supported our local archival practice. So the 30 repositories that are on our system, many of them have been working together and talking about archival practice for a long time. So we had a really good idea of what people would want. And we made a lot of use of the built-in customization features of ArchivesSpace. So we adapted the hoverovers so that we were referencing ISAD-G, which was the descriptive standards we're more comfortable with. But we weren't truly happy with ArchivesSpace until we'd put the identifier field in many more places. We added identifiers to the display of record trees on the staff user interface. We put them in the collection organization pane on the public user interface, and we made it so that the identifier could be seen when you're selecting a record to link to an assessment record. And we also made some changes to the display of our catalogues. I've put the URL for our discovery layer on this slide, so you can go and take a look. So some of the changes we made were to make particular fields a bit more visible, so and the default display of notes, and some of them were prompted by UK accessibility requirements. So that's something where we've fed the changes we've made back to Christine, and we're really hoping to carry on working with ArchivesSpace and sharing what we've learned. So now it's time for me to hand over to Tuan. I'll just go into the next slide.
So hi everybody, hopefully you can hear me.
I can hear you, Tuan.
So I mean, as Natalie kind of walked through, a lot of these customization were done very specific to the needs of our archivists at Cambridge. Some of them are quite unique to our needs, and so I'm not talking about the benefits of the plugins, but it's more around the whole development process and how we live with these changes. So what is key for us is we have quite a large instance of ArchivesSpace now with 30 repositories. It is something we need to know fairly well to be comfortable with. It's not treated as an off-the-shelf product and that we just leave it and run. So as part of our kind of migration process, I mean, as you saw, we did 30 repository into one with very different data models between them. So these came on from legacy databases and legacy systems. So we fortunately had a development team put together that spent a lot of time understanding the data models between ArchivesSpace and the difference between our data model, working with the API of ArchivesSpace so that we modify the data. So essentially to do the migration, we would have to tease apart data structure from the original sources, put them through a migration framework that basically reads the data, remap them to the ArchivesSpace data model, the hierarchical structures that we need to do, and then push the data into the API. So fortunately, we do have the developers with the skills to do the development ourselves. So then when it comes to doing modifications on top of ArchivesSpace, you basically have two choices. Where one is plugin, kind of a plugin model, and ArchivesSpace do lend itself to some nice plugin mechanism, so you can build something that is independent of the core of the ArchivesSpace source code and kind of apply them on top. And the development of the plugins are, follows fairly standard process in that obviously we work with the archivist, work out what changes are needed, and then work out the requirements, do the code, and deploy them. That's a fairly standard development process. But how do you live with that kind of process where you've got your own code layered on top of ArchivesSpace, the releases that we download, and how do you manage that on the kind of day-to-day production live environment is the tricky part. So what we have in our process is basically we have two environments, and sometimes we will run three environments to do this. So you have like your live environment, which I do not recommend you do any development on directly. So instead, what we do, we take a copy of our live production environment each time, push that into a development environment, do our code changes for our plugin, and then what we have, we run our environment using a configuration management tool called Puppet. And what that does is basically you script the process of installing the ArchivesSpace code base, the base version, then you load in the data from your database dump, and then you apply your plugins on top, and then that gives you your test environment. So you go through that process repeatedly until you find that your plugins are doing what you're happy with. So obviously, we've got several plugins on the go, and that whole process needs to be repeatable so that you can test it and you know what's happened. And then once you're happy, then you get a full sign off and everybody's happy, and then we basically change the configuration on our production environment to say, okay, now push these changes onto our live environment. So that's all done by fairly standard source code version control. So we use GitLab within the university, but you can use Git or whatever source code management tool you use. And then we have Puppet that basically extract them out, build them, and install them. So that's a quite nice way of making sure that what you have in your live environment is reproducible from source code. And that's quite a key thing to do. So on the next slide, please, Natalie. So then how do you live with these changes, given that we know there will be ArchivesSpace releases coming out, and also we might want to update our plugins? So you have to be quite careful because usually your plugin should be compatible, but you can't just rely on that. So we go through exactly the same process. Again, we do not just install the new version on the live environment. That will be quite a silly mistake when it goes wrong. So again, we go through the whole process of checking, looking at the release notes, see what's changed. We actually scan through the code diff. We actually compare the code to see what's changed, work out whether our plugins are still compatible or still required, and then update the plugin. Sometimes if we find that the plugin has been added to the core code, then we remove the plugin when it's no longer needed. So that's a fairly standard process, but I think you do need to keep up to date with it. And I think one of the questions raised in the previous presentation was also around over, the life of the product or the system that we use. How do you maintain and keep your plugin up to date? And that's a really key thing that, over time, you may use libraries that may need changes, and you need to go through this process. And the best way to do is actually have the process scripted so that you can always rebuild your development environment, apply the changes, test to see if it's good, and then roll it out. And if you keep that going as a standard business as usual process, then you have a good way of making sure that your plugins would always be working going forward, or at least you would detect any problems and fix them. So next slide, please. Now, sometimes some of the changes can't be done as a plugin, or sometimes you actually find it's better to submit them as a core code pool. Why you would want to put stuff into the core code? Well, if your changes are pulled into the core baseline, it means it's one plugin less you have to maintain, and it's usually something which is useful for the wider community rather than something very specific. So that's a nice thing to do. So the process is fairly standard within the kind of open source community that we look at what's needed, we can make the change, and we push the code in. Well, we submit the code for pulling in, and it what is good for us in this process? I mean, again, going back to the fact that ArchivesSpace is important to Cambridge, and it's good for the development team, if you have your developers, to be quite familiar with it. You may not be the super expert in terms of programming and releasing code for ArchivesSpace all the time, but there should be some level of comfort within your teams that you have a good understanding of ArchivesSpace and how it works, so that if there are issues, you can work with it. And it's one of the reasons why we picked an open source product to use instead of a proprietary product, is that you have access to the source code. And if anything, you can always make a fix to make things work for you. So it's quite important to at least kind of develop some understanding of how it works, how do you monitor, how you run it, so that when something goes wrong or something unexpected, you know where to look. So we've started to do some changes within ArchivesSpace. Some have been submitted as core code, so 3 so far, but over time, there are things that I'm sure we will find that we may develop on top. So that's why you would choose the kind of core code instead of a plugin. So if you have something that's kind of wider for community that's useful, then you add you submit that to the wider community. If something is very specific to your organization only, if you really just want this button to be pink just for you, then it's more of a plugin type of approach. So that's next slide, please, Natalie. Thank you. Yes, like I think I've already mentioned that it's really a case of what's wider community. So some of the locally stuff that we are looking at is things like removing the ID field, just to improve the way we display things. We have a project ongoing in terms of decolonizing our collections. So we are looking at how we can do that locally. And as Natalie mentioned, one of the most useful feature that we've been using so far is around the ability to export the data, either EAD or PDFs, at different level, but from the public user interface. So that is something that that's quite core to us and quite useful. There's some other stuff, some other works going on the team's been looking at. So recently there's been a lot of import, because we're still going through the process of adding more, quite a lot more data to our instance. So we're doing a lot of spreadsheet imports. Sometimes we found that once you've done an import, the solar index is not kept up to speed. So we've had to kind of re-index things quite frequently. Like, I think at the moment we've got our solar index restarting, I think, every week, just to make sure it's caught up to everything. So there's a few things that we are currently looking at locally. Anyway, that's hopefully give you a taste of what we've been doing locally in terms of coding and development on top of ArchivesSpace source code, and the process in which we kind of live. You have to live through that for your kind of live environment in business as usual mode. So it's something that's ongoing. It's not something that we just, install once and walk away from. I think that's about all I wanted to cover.
There we go.
Natalie.
So Jessica, if I stop sharing my screen, I think I could probably have a look at the questions. I don't want to. Is that right? Is that okay?
You can, or I could just read them to you, but then they would be a
okay.
surprise. So the first question, if you could just drop into the chat a URL to your catalog, I think people would be interested in seeing that. So we've had some questions about that. And then this is a great question. How much time do you spend, like months of your implementation, developer hours, keeping things up to date?
Maybe I can cover that one. So it's not that easy quantifiable in that I think what we allowed for is at least once or twice a year there would be some kind of ArchivesSpace release. So at least at a minimum you would need to allow for that time to update and maintain and test. What we want to do is take a proactive approach to maintenance rather than wait 3 years and find that things are horribly out of date. So we plan to put in at least 2 weeks of effort twice a year in terms of maintenance, and that's just normal maintenance. Obviously, if there are extra development or things that we want to change that we find later, those are more kind of mini projects mode where it depends on what it is we want to do. Obviously, we want to keep kind of fine line between doing things locally, but also requesting things to be done at a more community level, because sometimes it's a more of a common problem rather than just go off and do things on our own. I hope. I mean, it's hard to quantify because it really depends on organization, how much time you've got, and how much what other priorities you have.
Absolutely. Thanks. All right, we have one more question. I'm going to go ahead and read that. I know we're past time, but we're not going to cut your break short, so we are going to take the full 10-minute break. But the last question, looking at your public user interface, what is the benefit of having the reference code as part of the title in the record tree for researchers?
I think it's mainly that a lot of the records have already been cited. So often people are coming to a huge collection in search of a specific reference. And we found that it was just almost impossible to find them without the reference codes. So I think it's, to be honest, I think it maybe is a slight difference between kind of UK and US practice. So when we first had a look at ArchivesSpace, the one thing that jumped out at everybody was, where are our reference codes? So I think it might be more about that we just found it hard to work with until we'd done that.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. And thanks, Tuan. That was really informative and really helpful. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being willing to present a little bit after your normal office hours. That was great. We are going to go ahead and take a break. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So it is 56 minutes after the hour. It's 12:56 my time. So we will come back at 1:06 Eastern, or so 6 minutes after the hour, and we'll get started with our next presentation. So we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Thanks, everyone.